So it's my, first of all, I'd like to say what a fantastic pleasure it is to be here again at another annual APPI Conference, the 33rd, not my 33rd, unfortunately, my 10th, I think. But it's my great pleasure this morning to introduce our British Council speaker, the first speaker of the day, Dr. Victoria Clark. Victoria is the British Council's Global Assessment Solutions Manager, which, stripping away the British Council speak, means that Victoria is responsible for the development of our solutions, our assessments and our global testing. Victoria is one of us. She's an English language teacher, not anymore, but she certainly was. She holds 2 master's degrees in applied linguistics in EFL and received her PhD in applied linguistics from the University of Reading in England. She worked several years as an EFL teacher and trainer before specialising in the most fascinating and exciting area of English language teaching, which of course is assessment. And I'm not saying that just because I work in it. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Victoria Clark. Thank you very much.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Yes, wonderful. Okay, good morning everyone. It is with absolute pleasure that I'm here today. My first time in Portugal. So yes, I've taken advantage and spent a few days beforehand, I must admit. And it's my absolute pleasure to be here at the conference as well. I've heard a lot about this conference and I'm excited to be here. But what's more important is the theme of the conference this year is building connections. Now, as my colleague Tim mentioned, I was previously, or my first career was as a teacher of English as a foreign language. I then became a language tester. I don't think anyone's born wishing to be a language tester, but we end up becoming one somehow. And so the theme of building connections is perfect for me because it gives me the opportunity to actually discuss, present how we connect language assessment to the teaching practices and principles in the classroom. This is of vital importance, this connection. Without this connection, we cannot achieve our objectives. And our objectives are shared and clear. And that is for the students in our classes, for language learners to be able to use English effectively outside of the classroom, in order for them to pursue the opportunities socially, academically, and professionally. So, my title is English Language Assessment for the 21st Century Learner. Here I mean language learner. A language learner who is going to enter a globalized economy. A language learner who, I think I read yesterday, will possibly have 9 different jobs. A language learner who most probably will have to change careers mid-path, as most of us or some of us have done. A language learner who will have to embark on lifelong learning in order for them to be part of this new 21st century world that we live in. So, let's make a move and let me explain to you what I mean by connections. As you can see, my 21st century skills of digital and technology are 20th century, as you'll see from my presentations, to the horror of my team back at home. Okay, but here's some of the connections I want to talk about today. Well, the first theme or connection is between what you do in the classroom and what we do in the assessment. There has to be a connection. The second connection I want to talk about is the tasks that we have in our tests, in our assessments, have to be connected to the real world. It is vitally important that the tasks in our tests resemble, as far as is feasible in language testing, the tasks that the students will encounter outside the classroom. Why? Because otherwise the scores are not meaningful. If the tasks do not resemble what they need to do, both in language content and also cognitive processing, which I'll explain later, then looking at the score they receive, I cannot interpret what that means outside of my test room. So it's a very important concept that we must have real-world tasks. And I'll be giving you examples of these later, so bear with me. And finally, and I think this is very important, I'm going to show a connection between theory and practice, mainly about the concept of communicative competence. It is a word that is bandied around a lot since the 1980s, and I don't think any teacher would admit to being a non-communicative teacher. I think that would be seen as a bad teacher, perhaps, in our societies today. But what does it actually mean, communicative competence? I hear it a lot from teachers who claim their methodology is based around communicative competence, but I want to go a little bit deeper into that and how we actually connect that to our tests. Okay, so very quickly, to give you an idea of how the next 50 minutes or so will go, I'm going to talk about traditional language teaching practices and current ones. Okay? I'll also talk about some very important principles or qualities of language tests, the principles which underlie every time we develop a test. These principles are part of our entire thinking from the design development stage. And then at the end of the presentation, I want to look at certain features that make tests communicative and show you examples using some tests that I know and I've designed, developed, of how we can incorporate that into the test. Now remember, the shared objective here is for students to be able to learn English effectively. Good tests have positive washback on teaching and learning. It doesn't matter how good your teaching is, if the test at the end the students need to take is not good, is not communicative, then the learning will be affected negatively. So the connection between teaching and testing is essential. I say this often, and I will repeat saying this continuously till I die. Language assessment literacy is not an option for teachers, it's a professional duty. And I think the more we understand language testing per se, the better we will be at our jobs. And the more we learn about teaching from language testers, the better we will be at our jobs. So it's a real pleasure to be here today. Okay, another objective is to keep you awake. Language testing, despite what my colleague says, is the most exciting part of teaching. I'm not sure about that for most of us. For me, perhaps, but whatever. All right, we've seen this before. Curriculum, teaching, assessment, there needs to be this connection. It's often in theory rather than in practice. So it's absolutely essential that we know that the learning process can only exist effectively if we are aligned, if we are connected. So what does that mean? Well, in the past, language teaching was more about believing that language can be broken down into little pieces. We can break grammar down into tenses, articles, participles, etc., etc. And then we can teach students grammar and vocabulary, test them in grammar and vocabulary, often through reading exercises and multiple choice questions on grammar and vocabulary, and then, hey presto, they would be able to speak English. This didn't happen. We know this not to be the case. I say it's traditional. I wish I could say it was past, but unfortunately many countries around the world still teach English in this fashion, in the native language of the student, in a grammar translation type of methodology. There is a lot of obviously negative impact on that, we can talk later, but just to get the record straight, I am not saying that there's no room in the classroom for this methodology. There is a room in the classroom for all types of methodology, even the grammar translation. I think it's good that we can sometimes give our students exercises where they practice grammar or read in text. I think that's very useful Personally, my style of learning languages is very analytical, and I like to see the grammar. But what we're saying is this is not the only way we should teach English in a classroom. We know it not to be effective. So what is effective language teaching? Well, today's classroom, I'm talking about what we do in the classroom, and you know very well, but I want to talk about the principles that we employ today to show how it connects to how we test later on, so bear with me. Well, we've moved away from usage. Usage is that grammar translation concept, only learning about the grammar and the vocab. And we now talk about language use. When we talk about language use, we're talking about students being able to use language effectively to communicate in a variety of situations relevant to their needs. Let me repeat that, because that is the cornerstone of what we do in language testing. Language use is about students using language effectively to communicate in a variety of situations relevant to their needs. Now, when I say communication, I just want to clarify a few things because sometimes it's not quite clear. So, 3 types of communication have been identified, and the first type is interactional. Interactional mode is when we talk to someone else, we interact, we chat about the weather, we discuss a problem at work. But there is this to and from, where we can negotiate meaning, ask for clarification, finish each other's sentences. I can show you I'm interested by back channeling. Yes, yeah, wow. I can, I have to think on my feet. I have to use strategies to keep going. Sometimes I repeat the last bit of grammar that you said. Sometimes I use chunks. I have my ways to interact. So that's interactional communication. Our students need to be able to communicate on an interactional mode. But there's others. What about the interpretive? Communication is also about understanding what's being communicated, interpreting what you're reading and what you're hearing. Because sometimes what we say or what we write is not what we mean. If I were to say today, oh, it's very warm in here, this could be an observation on the temperature of the room. It could also be an indirect request for someone to turn the air conditioning on. It's okay, the organisers, it's not hot in here, it's just an example, but it's a good one, I think. But the idea is sometimes what we say is not always direct. So we have to learn, and students have to be taught, to interpret meaning, to interpret communication, to read between the lines. That's a very important communicative mode. And finally, presentation mode is what I'm doing today. I'm holding the floor in terms of linguistic jargon. I'm holding the floor, and I'm going to have a long turn of about 50-55 minutes with almost no opportunity for feedback from the listener. Only at the end are you allowed to ask questions in this mode. Okay? So as a presenter in presentational mode, I have to be able to analyze my audience, transfer the information I wish to give to my audience in a way, in a mode that the audience is able to understand. I also have to structure my talk so that you can follow me and you don't lose thread. Okay? Perhaps I give examples, perhaps I summarize, but I have to have a presentation mode of communication. When we talk about language users using language to communicate effectively, we often try to incorporate these 3 concepts. As I'm talking, can you keep trying to think, how do we test that? Okay, I'm going to come to that in the end, but as I'm talking all through the next few minutes and the next hour, how do we test that? Just try to think, how do I test those forms of communication? I'll tell you later. Excitement. Okay. The other thing in the classroom is, again, we're bringing the real world into the classroom. Now, this is quite a contentious point of view in many places, because I think a lot of our Western concept of teaching now is around task-based, real-world, authenticity, relevant to the student, meaningful to the student, okay? So I'll give you an example. In looking at teacher practices in Oman and Saudi Arabia, I saw text about snowmen and skiing. And students were supposed to discuss this in pairs. It's beyond relevant. It's not part of their real world. And of course, if we keep to the classroom at a B1 level or below, it should all be within the familiar. So it's really important that we keep real world tasks. And even if we go outside of B1 to say B2, high intermediate, so for those who are IELTS people, B2 is around 5.5 to 7 bands. Even though I have to introduce wide range of text and different accents and different genre, it still has to be real world. That's something people would do in the real world later. I'm not just talking about the task itself, but the skills and competencies that we need in order to fulfill that task, perform that task. So meaningful communication, meaningful tasks, real-world tasks are vitally important. Otherwise, we also know that students disengage when they don't see the connection between the classroom and the real world. We know that to be true. And my other problem with non-real world tasks is the real impact of that on learning. I personally am very much against the error correction mode in testing. You know, when you have a sentence, 4 parts of the sentence are underlined and 1 part is wrong. Yeah? Have you seen those sort of test items? I personally am completely against that because 2 reasons. First, you don't do this in the real world. We don't have 4 choices, 1 wrong in the real world in language. So I don't see the connection. If this gentleman here got 10 out of 10, the only thing I can say is he's good at looking for errors. I don't actually know how I can meaningfully communicate that score. The other and the biggest problem I have is washback. The last thing I'd like my 14-year-old child to do is spend lessons finding errors in sentences. I want them to write blogs, role play, have presentations, discuss with friends. I'd like them to listen to some texts and perform instructions based on that listening text. I'd like them to actually do what they need to do outside of that classroom. So real-world tasks are vitally important, in my opinion, for teaching. And again, what about testing? And then the productive skills. This may sound obvious, but it's only really now in many parts of the world that speaking and writing are important in classes. I'll give you a really great example. In China, there are 30 million annual college entrance tests. So 30 million, 30 million. Until this year, speaking was not compulsory. So only 18,000 students took the speaking component. You do not have to have a PhD in language testing to understand the impact of that, right? What do you think? Clearly, no one bothered to teach speaking in class. Why? Why waste time? Parents didn't want their children to have speaking in class. Why? It's not tested. The other issue was teachers didn't need to speak English to be English teachers. It wasn't required, okay? Because it's not tested, okay? So clearly, the impact on society was a generation of teachers who didn't speak English, and in fact, the work we work with are testing at an A2 level in speaking, which is a high beginner in old language, yeah. And the students clearly at an A1 level, at the word and phrase level, basically. So, this changed. We now have a speaking component in China for the college English test. Let's see how that goes, but clearly we understand the washback on that. Finally, and this is what I want to spend a few minutes on, we are communicative. Again, it's a word that is bandied around a lot in the English teaching world and the English testing world. But what does that mean? Now, there are many models of communicative competence that we can look at that have been developed. Bachmann, 1990, is perhaps the most famous one. There have been others, but we still use Bachmann 1990s model in a lot of our test development. But I'm going to simplify communicative competence, if I may, to the most basic of elements. Okay, just so, as you can see from my slides there, digital technology there. This took me about 20 minutes to do this, so have sympathy for me. And I'm not head of the computer testing section in the British Council, don't worry. My field is validity, not computer testing. Okay, so communicative competence is, and I've just said this previously, the ability to use English effectively to communicate in various situations and contexts. Okay, now communicative competence is 4 competencies basically, okay? Now, we've talked about in the past, or traditionally, linguistic competence was the only one we focused on. Okay? Grammar, vocab, pronunciation, spelling, handwriting. Okay. Sound familiar? Okay. Linguistic competence. But what we know today, for someone to be an effective user of language, linguistic competence is not enough. They need other competencies. Now, please remember, as I keep talking, how do we test this? How do we test this? Keep this in mind, because that's where I'm coming to later. There is an end, don't worry, there is an end. So linguistic, I don't need to explain, we know that. Let me go to social linguistic at the bottom. In order for us to be effective language users, and I'm talking students, teachers, and anyone who's a language user, we need social linguistic competence. What does that mean? Well, in very basic terms, and please excuse me, I'm going to bring it down to as much basic as possible so I can help us to understand testing as well. It means the ability to understand language changes in context. If I'm talking to an older person, I should try to be more polite. If I'm talking to a child, I often use baby language or say, "Hello, darling, give me the pen, sweetie." I will change my language, not something the way I talk to my boss is different to that, may I add. But even if you're talking to the same person, if the topic changes, language changes. If I want to talk to my boss today about this conference, I would just chat and say, "Wonderful conference, well attended, everything was fantastic." But what happens if I want to ask my boss this afternoon later for some money? Pay rise, okay? And please note, I work for a charity, so it's a pointless conversation, but it doesn't matter. Let's say I wanted to talk to him about a pay rise. First of all, I'd probably plan it. I'd probably plan what I was going to say. It wouldn't be unplanned speech. Secondly, it'd be a longer talk. I'd have to explain why I think I deserve a pay rise, perhaps give examples of some of the work I've done. I would have some ideas on how to have an argument against some of his rebuttals, and I'd be ready to defend my position. It's a very different way of speaking than requesting perhaps next week, Tuesday, off to go to the doctors. But also in social linguistics, we also do have to understand politeness and what we can and can't do. But please be careful here. Some of you will say, well, of course we know that with older people we need to be more respectful. Yes, a lot of these concepts are universal, but not all of them. When I lived in Iran, the first question anyone would ask me is, what's your name? The second question was, how much do you earn? Okay. And without specifying the country, my colleagues in a country in Asia would say to me, you look very nice today. Oh, thank you very much. Yesterday you look fat. Ladies and gentlemen, in case you're not clear, not something we do in England, okay? Neither salary nor weight, unless you like to be hurt, all right? So no, not all things are universal, may I add. The other problem is, even if they are universal, we all know we have to speak politely to someone in charge, right? We might not have the language to do so. A lot of my research in the past has been putting students in tests where the tester is a young, hip, cool person, jeans, Coca-Cola. And then halfway through they have to leave. And then an older person in a suit who's important turns up. And then the students, you can see, they're already sitting up straighter. You can see in their heads, this is a different situation, the context has changed. But unfortunately, the country in which I was doing this research, the students were still terribly informal to this person when they needed or they perceived they should be more formal. One thing is understanding, and we call that socio-pragmatics. The other thing is having the language to achieve that difference, and we call that pragmalinguistics. So it's these two concepts that we have to teach people. Because we forgive linguistic errors, we don't forgive social linguistic errors as quickly. We don't wish you to be perceived as rude, unempathetic, distant, unkind, just because of your language as opposed to your personality. Unfortunately, non-language teachers are not as understanding as us in the real world. Okay, linguistic, social linguistic, that's clear. Strategic. Strategic competence is vitally important because it means keep going. We all have gaps in our knowledge, whether it be language, vocab, grammar, social linguistic gaps. So we have an option. We can either break down communication, and I can say, what's that word? Wait a minute, let me think. What's the word? 1 minute, please. This is not a way we communicate. Or we have strategies to get through that. I could either avoid the word, I don't know, avoid the grammar, I don't know, which is what most of us do when we write in a foreign language, right? Or I could coin a phrase. If I wanted a corkscrew and I didn't know the word, I might say, I need a opener for a wine bottle. I know it's quite early, but somewhere it's 2 p.m, I'm sure. Or I could even use my own language, Korkenzieher, in case anyone happened to speak German, for example. I have ways in which to keep going. Pauses are not tolerated in our language. Therefore, I have to keep going. And without these strategies, whether they can be taught or they need to be practiced in class, that's another conversation for another day. But without these strategies, I cannot communicate. I am not an effective communicator. I will be a burden on my listener. And you won't sit very long next to me at a dinner party. Okay? That's for certain. Unless, of course, we're English teachers, then we can talk to anyone at any level for any length. Hence, they always sit next to us, right? guaranteed. Okay, strategic. The last one I have, so I've got language, I've got politeness, culture, context, and then I've got keep going, strategies to overcome gaps. The last one is very important as well because it's structuring long speech and long text. When I have a long turn, as I'm doing now, I need to make sure you understand me by giving you examples, summarising, telling you when I'm going on to the next section. Otherwise, you'll lose the thread and you'll get bored. How many times, English teachers here, how many times have we had to go back in our students' essays and reread the first or second paragraph? Right, okay, yeah, discourse competence. All right, simple as that. That they haven't signposted or offered us enough evidence or help so that we can follow. Very important in a business environment with students, very important in an academic environment with students, and very important if students want to be part of a gang and tell a bit of gossip or tell a joke where you hold the floor longer than that interactional. I have a lot of empathy to students who study abroad. At 18, I went to Germany to do my degree, and at 21, I went to France to do my master's, my first master's. Now, in those days, we only had linguistic competence. It was very difficult for us to have friends, okay? I could read Goethe, haven't since, but there you go. I could do a lot, but not really make friends, integrate, be part of a community. That's not really what we want for our students today. So these 4 competencies is how I define, very basically, communicative competence. We need to give opportunities in the classroom for that. And again, my talk is about testing. How do I give opportunities in tests for that? Well, we've seen this. The answer is through communicative language testing. Okay, through communicative language testing. But again, we can't just give that word it's communicative without proving it's communicative. So, all those competencies I mentioned, they need to be in the test so that we can elicit those competencies. I'll give you examples at the end, but before, I've got about 10 minutes on this part, and then I'll give you examples of cumulative tests. But I can't talk about testing until I talk about the 4 principles of testing. Sometimes they're called qualities, because a good test is valid, reliable, practical, and has positive impact. Before I even design and develop a test, these are part of my thinking. No test is a good test without it being valid, reliable, practical, and with positive impact. So forget even the communicative aspect. First, they have to be this. So let's start with what they mean first. I'm sure you've seen these words before. Unfortunately, language testers have a terrible, what's the word? We're all the same, language testers. When we define a term, we make it more difficult, the definition, than the actual term itself. And I'm also guilty of that. So I'm going to try and simplify it and then give you the ridiculously scary definition. Validity is a property of a test and a property of the use of the test. Okay, let me explain. A test is valid if it measures or assesses what it says it's going to measure. A very clear example, one government has sent us a test of speaking, which is pen and paper multiple choice, for us to evaluate. Okay, is that clear, everyone? Pen and paper multiple choice, test of speaking. Now, clearly, that's not measuring speaking, right? That's a pretty extreme example, but it's one on our desk at the moment. Yeah. Welcome to the world of cultural relations. Now, here's the thing. We know speaking to be grammar, vocabulary, fluency, interactional competence, discourse competence, pronunciation. Okay, we know them to be certain skills and competencies are part of what we understand to be speaking. We call these constructs in language testing. The construct of speaking, i.e. the skills and strategies and competencies that underlie that skill, are grammar, vocab, discourse, interactional, pronunciation, etc., etc. If I wanted to test speaking, I would have to have a variety of these in the test, or elicit that, so I can measure that. So you'd have to actually speak, right? How can I measure pronunciation or fluency if you don't speak? But validity is a little bit more complicated than that. If you have a textbook for year 1 and you want to measure if the students have achieved all the objectives of that textbook so they can go to textbook 2 in year 2, then you can't just test parts of some chapters. You can't just choose chapter 2, 6, 8 and 9, parts of them to test. You need to look at the objectives, the topics, the language, the tasks in the whole textbook and give a representative sample of those in the actual test. Otherwise, you're not testing what you said you're testing, which is textbook 1. Okay? So validity means that we're actually measuring what we say we're measuring. Listening is the construct of listening. Listening for detail, listening for the main idea, listening for gist, listening for words unfamiliar, words in context, listening for inference. This is listening test. And if you look at, say, for example, our IELTS test or Cambridge tests, then you'll look in the listening test and you should be able to see what the question is asking. Is it for detail? Is it for main idea? Is it for gist? Is it for context? Is it for inference? If we don't include those skills in our listening test, then we're not measuring listening. Okay? So validity is we measure what we say we measure. Here's the thing though. IELTS reading test is a valid test of reading, okay? We have enough body of evidence to show that. We test what we say we're testing. But IELTS reading is not valid to place you on a writing course. Okay? So the test itself, regardless of if it's valid, the use of that test has to be valid as well. I can't use a reading test to place you on a writing course. I shouldn't use workplace English test to place you in an academic context. It's not valid for that purpose. So validity is both the test and the use. Okay, so here's the scary definitions that I am guilty of. The first one is we measure what we say, and the second one is that we use the test. Doesn't matter if the test is valid. If it's not being used for valid purpose, then there is no validity. In the old days, the first one was all we talked about. A test is valid, therefore we can use it. We know that not to be the case. Right, okay. Now, reliability, I'll jump a little bit because I'm running out of time. This is quite an easy concept. This is consistency. If I'm B1 in French, he's B1 in French. If we take a test, we should both get B1, correct? If you take an IELTS test today and you're band 5.5 and your colleague takes it in another country, another version, she's 5.5, then she should get 5.5. One thing we cannot control is you, the test taker. You might be tired, you might be sick, you might like tests, you might be frightened of tests. We can't control you. That's the only variable that we can't control. But we can control the rest, and the rest is the test itself. We have to make sure that the versions are the same difficulty, that your IELTS test today is of the same difficulty level as her IELTS test next week, next month, next year. You have the same amount of questions, you have the same time, in the same conditions. You're in a venue where you all have access to aircon if it's hot, heating if it's cold. You can't take an IELTS test in a cold room and they have a nice warm, cozy room. We have to standardize, be consistent with not just the test, but also the venue. And then the tricky part, the scoring as well. Not only do we have to make sure the scorers, the raters are qualified, they are trained, standardized, and constantly monitored. So we can control reliability. We know we have valid tests. We measure what we say we measure. We have research to back that up. And we have, obviously, a lot of research around our own reliability as well. Okay, so we need a valid and reliable test, right? What about practical? Well, a test, to design a test, if you want me to design a test off your own test, you want 4 skills, test in Portuguese, etc., for 13-year-olds, I'll probably need about £500,000 from you to design, develop, pre-test, trial, give you a live administration of a 4 skills test. I will also need a team of people with obviously their PhDs, masters in language testing, experience, item writers, statisticians, we have psychometricians in our team, we have rater trainers, etc., etc. Do you have the skills and knowledge to design tests? When you do have a test, you have to choose, what about the money? How much money can you afford for each test? You might want a 4 skills test, but you only have £3 per person to use on that test. There's a problem. You might want computer tests, but you've only got 40 computers and 3,000 students to test this week. So all these things, when we design, develop tests, we have to balance and make sure that we have a clear understanding of the reliability, practicality, validity, and most important, impact. If the test doesn't have good, positive washback and impact on society and education, washback in the classroom, then we shouldn't be designing tests. Test less, test better. That's our mantra. Too many tests have no use. Good tests have great uses. Okay? So, I talked about those error corrections. Their washback on the classroom, I dismiss. A good communicative test has positive washback. So, what's communicative? We're getting to the last 10 minutes, everyone. Although I didn't know, there's no coffee break after, but still. Okay, I've given you 5 features, and I'm going to give you an example of communicative tests. Okay? 5 features that we have we understand to be important for tests to be communicative. Remember, communicative is the ability to use English effectively to communicate in a range of situations relevant to the test taker student. Okay. So, meaningful, context, creativity, unpredictability, performance, and finally, integrated. When I talk about integrated, I talk about the tests need to elicit linguistic, social-linguistic, discourse, and strategic. Otherwise, what's the impact? If I just have a grammar test, what's going to happen in the classroom, everyone? Okay, it's clear. I'm going to use, if I may, shamelessly, but I have no choice, a test that I've been involved in the design development on for the British Council, a test called APPI. We were very fortunate to design the test in 2012, so we had all the modern concepts of language available to us, as well as the CFR, of course. So I'll give you some examples from that test just to show what I mean by meaningful and authentic. Well, have a look at this. This is a speaking task, okay? It's about a low B1, all right? Now, looking at the picture, clearly this is for the Chinese context. In the Arab world, we'd have a picture of Eid. In European, we may have a picture of, say, Christmas or another celebration. It is vitally important that we provide students, especially young students, with something familiar to them so they can engage with the actual task. Not only that, the task asks them to describe, inform, and explain. First of all, these are all concepts and functions that are at the B1 level. But it's also something we do outside the classroom. So students will see this. See, even though I've got these 5 features, they all mix. They all overlap. They've got this picture, they have no time to prepare their answer, so it's spontaneous, unpredictable. They have to speak, and they have to do what they do outside the world, in the real world. But this is meaningful to them. The students will see this as the dragon, Chinese New Year, many people on the streets, the smoke could be the firecrackers, we've got Chinese lanterns, everything that will engage the Chinese student, hopefully to engage them to speak. Context is vitally important. If language changes due to context, every task we have must have context. Otherwise, who are they talking to? Why? Where? When? Because that changes language, right? So if we have a look at this task, it's a write-in task. What you'll notice is there are two parts to this writing. This is a B2 level, if anyone's interested. There's two parts. The first part is write an email to a mate, a friend, okay? Someone you know. Just moaning because the gym membership fee has increased and I think they're closing on Wednesdays early now, okay? The second part is writing to a stranger, someone you don't know. It's longer. So the first part is short. You probably don't need discourse competence here. In the second part, it will be multi-paragraph, so discourse competence is necessary. Strategic competence is necessary because you might have to avoid certain constructions. Not the best strategic competence, but that's reality. But it also shows that language changes. Here are some examples. In the first one, you don't even have to use full sentences. Do you use full sentences with your friends when you write to them? In informal language? In emails? In the second part, however, obviously the sentences are longer, there'll be multiple clauses, at a high level there'll be nominalization at the beginning of the sentence, etc. There'll be clear sort of flowing. You'll be able to understand what the problem is and what they want, etc. So language changes with context. If we don't give context in our test, how do we test people's social linguistic competence? Creativity, unpredictability. Students shouldn't know what's coming next in a test, right? They shouldn't be able to plan ahead. So here's a good one, where this part, you read this, it's a write-in test at around, probably a high B1. You read this and then you respond, and then when you enter, this pops up, and then you respond, and then this pops up, and then you respond. Does that look like a real-world task to you? Do you do this in email? You write, send, receive, etc. Same in chat rooms, etc. Okay? That's how we text or write. That's real-world tasks, but also you don't know what's going to come next. So it's unpredictable, can't be planned in advance. You can't learn phrases like, it's a double-edged sword, or other horrendous cliches that we find used in written text. Unpredictability is communicative. Performance, I don't need to give you too many examples of that. Performance means that they actually have to speak or write. That in the speaking test, they need to perform the actual skill of speaking, and in the writing test, they need to write. Not find errors in sentences or tell me which sentence has the correct punctuation. For me, personally, because I know many testing colleagues do not agree with this, but for me personally, finding an error in punctuation does not mean you write correctly in terms of punctuation. It just means you're good at finding errors in punctuation in sentences, okay? So you need to actually perform. Here's ones for students, teenagers. In what ways do you keep in touch with your friends? A low level might just say Facebook. A higher level teen might say sometimes through Facebook, sometimes we meet in a cafe. the whole idea is cumulative language testing needs to elicit speaking and writing. And last one is around integrated language skills. I have to integrate linguistic, social linguistic, discourse, and linguistic, social linguistic, discourse, and strategic. Now, please remember, at a very low level of language learning, linguistic is the most predominant, right? That's clear, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't begin looking at different contexts and looking at strategies, okay? So this is a B2 speaking test. The picture itself it doesn't really help, it's just there to engage the mind. You have to speak for 2 minutes. You have 1 to plan and 2 to speak. 2 minutes is a very long time. Time yourself. Just put a stopwatch. The students have to keep going. They probably have just had enough time to plan roughly what they want to say, but not enough to write it down, obviously, because we want to make sure they have discourse competence, they have strategies to keep going, they have linguistic competence, of course, and they also know that this is a presentational mode, should be semi-formal at least, you know. Obviously, this is a semi-direct speaking test, so you're talking to a computer. But basically, we should be able to elicit the full range of competencies. If there is not a long presentational mode in the speaking test, we do not see discourse competence or strategies. If we don't see it in a test, we don't do it in the classroom. So, my final words here. So this is just the last one here, another one for integrated skills. This is around context, actually. This is a listening task. And as you can see, linguistically, if you only had linguistic competence, you wouldn't understand this. You need to have some social linguistic competence. Now, unfortunately, this is a bad example because I think my husband might think this was romantic. But I married an Englishman, and it's not meant for Englishmen, these tests, so we're probably okay. We're probably okay. I'm not sure about the Portuguese husbands, ladies, but for English, this is probably not a good test, yeah? Okay, so finally, what I wanted to show you is that what you do in the classroom needs to be incorporated in our tests, so it will have positive washback on your classroom and actually support you in what you do. The test tasks have to resemble real tasks for us to have a meaningful score. So we can say, your 9 out of 10 in this test means outside the classroom you can do this. Otherwise, what's the point? Theory of cumulative competence should not just be theory. It needs to be incorporated in practice in our tests to have positive washback on the classroom. So, there you go. Digital skills, fantastic. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm not sure there's time for questions, actually, but I'd be happy to take questions here if you have any, because I think we're now 11:30. So if anyone has any questions, I'll stay by the front of the stage. Thank you very much again.